Sarah stared at the mahogany table in the lawyer's office, her hands trembling as Mr. Henderson's voice droned on about assets and beneficiaries. Her father had been gone for 3 months now, and this was the moment she'd been dreading. Next to her, her older brother Marcus sat with his usual confident posture, occasionally nodding as if he already knew what was coming. To my son Marcus, I leave the family home at 1247 Oakwood Drive, valued at approximately $1.2 million, along with my entire investment portfolio, currently worth $800,000, and all remaining assets, including my vintage car collection. Mr. Henderson paused, glancing at Sarah with what seemed like sympathy. To my daughter Sarah, I leave my personal effects and the contents of safety deposit box number 347 at First National Bank. The room felt like it was spinning. Sarah had worked double shifts as a nurse for years, helping her father with his medical bills when his health started failing. She'd moved back home after her divorce to take care of him, while Marcus had barely visited except for holidays. Personal effects and a safety deposit box she didn't even know existed? Meanwhile, Marcus inherited everything worth having. Marcus reached over and squeezed her shoulder, but his touch felt hollow. "Don't worry, sis. We're family. I'll make sure you're taken care of." His words stung worse than the will itself. She didn't want his charity. She wanted to understand why their father had done this. After the meeting, Sarah drove to their childhood home in a daze. Marcus was already there, standing in the living room like he owned the place, which apparently he now did. The house still smelled like their father's pipe tobacco and the lavender sachets their mother had placed in every room before she passed 5 years ago. "I know this seems unfair," Marcus said, not quite meeting her eyes. "But Dad always said the oldest son should carry on the family legacy. You know how traditional he was." Sarah wanted to scream. Traditional? Their father had raised her to be independent, had bragged about her nursing degree to anyone who would listen. He taught her to change oil in cars and fix leaky faucets because a person should be able to take care of themselves. This felt like a betrayal of everything she thought she knew about him. That night, she couldn't sleep in her childhood bedroom, knowing it would soon belong to Marcus. She kept thinking about the safety deposit box. What could possibly be in there that her father considered important enough to leave her? The next morning, she drove to First National Bank with the key Mr. Henderson had given her and her father's death certificate. The bank manager, Mrs. Chen, led her to the vault. "Your father visited this box quite regularly over the years," she mentioned, as they walked down the narrow corridor, lined with metal doors. "Always seemed very particular about its contents." Sarah's hands shook as she inserted the key. Inside the long metal box were dozens of envelopes, each one labeled with a date going back 15 years. Her name was written on the front of each one in her father's careful handwriting. Underneath the envelopes was a thick manila folder and what looked like legal documents. She opened the most recent envelope first, dated just 2 weeks before her father's death. His familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes immediately. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered my secret. I know the will must have been a shock, and I know you're probably feeling betrayed. But I need you to understand that everything I did was to protect you and to right a wrong that has haunted me for decades." Her heart pounded as she continued reading. "Marcus is not your full brother, he doesn't know this, and your mother made me promise never to tell him. When your mother and I were briefly separated early in our marriage, she had a relationship with another man. Marcus was born from that relationship, but we reconciled and I raised him as my own because I loved your mother and I wanted our family to stay together." Sarah's legs gave out, and she had to sit down on the small chair in the viewing room. This couldn't be real. Marcus, with his dark hair and brown eyes that never quite matched their father's blue ones or her own green ones. Marcus, who everyone said looked like their mother's side of the family. She reached for the manila folder with shaking hands. Inside were DNA test results, dated from 3 years ago. The results confirmed what her father had written. Marcus shared no biological relation to their father. There were also copies of their parents' separation papers from 38 years ago. and a private investigator's report about Marcus's biological father. But the most shocking discovery was at the bottom of the folder. Legal documents showing that their father had been secretly moving assets for the past 5 years. The investment portfolio that Marcus had inherited was nearly empty. The real money, over $2 million, had been moved to accounts in Sarah's name. The house, while legally left to Marcus, had a massive mortgage against it that he'd have to pay off, and according to the documents, the vintage car collection had been sold years ago, with the proceeds also moved to Sarah's accounts. Another envelope contained a letter explaining everything. I discovered the truth about Marcus 3 years ago, when I had some health scares and decided to do genetic testing for the family medical history. I was devastated, not because I loved Marcus any less, but because I realized your mother had lied to me for decades. But then I realized this gave me an opportunity to ensure that our true family legacy stayed in the bloodline. Sarah's father had spent the last 3 years of his life carefully orchestrating this elaborate plan. He'd made it appear that Marcus was getting everything while secretly ensuring that Sarah, his biological daughter, inherited the real wealth. He'd even arranged for Marcus to receive what looked like valuable assets that were actually encumbered with debt, or had already been liquidated. I know this seems cruel, the letter continued, but Marcus has had advantages his entire life that you haven't. I paid for his college, his law school, his first house down payment. I gave him opportunities in my business that you never got because you chose nursing instead. He's established in his career and has never had to struggle the way you have. You sacrificed your own comfort to take care of me these last few years, and you deserve to be rewarded for that love and dedication. The final envelope contained instructions for a trust fund that would provide Marcus with enough money to live comfortably, but not the fortune he thought he was inheriting. He will still receive enough to maintain his lifestyle, but the bulk of the estate goes to you, where it belongs. You are my legacy, Sarah. You have my heart, my values, and my blood. Sarah sat in that sterile bank vault for over an hour, reading and rereading the letters. Her father had known that Marcus would likely be cruel to her after the will reading, had predicted that he would offer her charity rather than genuine support. He'd orchestrated this entire scenario to protect her while also giving Marcus a chance to show his true character. When she finally drove home, Marcus was loading boxes into his BMW. He looked up as she pulled into the driveway, and his expression was triumphant rather than sympathetic. "I'm moving some of Dad's things to storage," he said. "I thought you could stay in the house for a few more weeks while you figure out your next move. Maybe find a nice apartment somewhere." Sarah looked at this man who had been her big brother for 36 years, who had shared Christmas mornings and family vacations with her, who had taught her to ride a bike and helped her with math homework. He had no idea that his entire identity was built on a lie, and she found herself pitying him rather than hating him. "Actually, Marcus, I think I'll be fine," she said quietly. "I have some things to take care of at the bank, but you go ahead with your plans." Over the next few weeks, Sarah watched as Marcus's inheritance began to unravel. The investment portfolio turned out to be worth less than $50,000 after taxes and fees. The house came with a mortgage that required payments he couldn't afford on his lawyer's salary. The vintage cars he'd bragged about to his friends didn't exist. He called her repeatedly, panicking about the financial mess, asking if she had any idea what had happened to their father's money. Sarah met with the financial advisor her father had recommended in his letters, a woman named Janet Morrison, who had been helping orchestrate this plan for years. Janet explained that Sarah now had access to accounts worth over $2 million, plus a smaller trust fund that would provide Marcus with about $60,000 a year for life. "Your father was very specific about his wishes," Janet explained. "He wanted Marcus to experience some struggle, to understand what it meant to have to work for things. But he didn't want him to be destitute. The trust fund will kick in once the house situation is resolved." Sarah realized she had a choice to make. She could let Marcus struggle and learn from this experience, or she could reveal the truth about their parentage and the real inheritance. Either way would change their relationship forever. She decided to invite Marcus to lunch at their father's favorite diner. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a defeat in his posture she'd never seen before. When he sat down across from her, he immediately started apologizing. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I know I was awful after the will reading. I just assumed." I thought Dad had left me in charge to take care of the family, but everything's falling apart. I don't understand what happened to his money, and I can't afford the house payments. I might have to sell everything." For the first time since their father's death, Marcus sounded humble and genuine. Sarah made her decision. "Marcus, I need to tell you something, and it's going to change everything you think you know about our family." She pulled out copies of the letters their father had left her, the ones that explained the inheritance plan, but not the truth about Marcus's parentage. She couldn't bring herself to destroy his sense of identity completely. As Marcus read, his face went through a series of emotions: confusion, anger, relief, and finally something that looked like respect. "He planned all of this? The whole thing was designed to teach me a lesson?" "He wanted to make sure I was taken care of, but he also wanted you to understand what it felt like to struggle. He didn't hate you, Marcus. He loved you enough to want you to become a better person." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at the papers. Finally, he looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I have been a terrible brother to you. These last few weeks, trying to manage everything alone, I keep thinking about how you took care of Dad for years without complaining. You gave up your own life to make sure he was comfortable, and I took it for granted." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "We're still family, Marcus. That's never going to change." They worked together to resolve the financial situation. Sarah used part of her inheritance to help Marcus transition to a smaller place he could afford, and she made sure he knew about the trust fund that would provide him with steady income. She never told him the truth about his biological father, deciding that some secrets were meant to stay buried. 6 months later, Sarah bought a small house near the hospital where she worked. Marcus visited regularly, and their relationship had evolved into something more honest and equal than it had ever been. He'd started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping people who couldn't afford lawyers, and he often talked about how much he'd learned from struggling those few months. Sometimes Sarah would drive by their childhood home, which Marcus had eventually sold to a young family with children. She thought about their father and the elaborate plan he'd created to teach them both lessons about family, money, and what really mattered in life. He'd given her financial security, but more importantly, he'd given her the knowledge that she was truly loved and valued. The safety deposit box sat empty now at First National Bank, but the lessons it had contained continued to shape both their lives. Sarah had learned that sometimes the people who love us most make decisions that seem cruel on the surface, but are actually acts of profound love and wisdom. And Marcus had learned that being given everything doesn't make you worthy of it, but earning it through struggle and growth does. Their father's final gift hadn't really been money at all. It had been the chance for both his children to discover who they really were and what they were capable of becoming. Their father's final gift hadn't really been money at all. It had been the chance for both his children to discover who they really were and what they were capable of becoming. But the story was far from over. 3 years had passed since that revelation in the diner, and Sarah had settled into a life she never could have imagined. The inheritance had allowed her to reduce her nursing hours and pursue a master's degree in healthcare administration. She'd also started a small foundation that provided financial assistance to families dealing with long-term medical care, something born from her own experience caring for their father. Marcus had indeed changed, but the transformation had been more complex than either of them expected. The trust fund their father had established provided him with enough income to live modestly, but it had also come with conditions that Sarah was only now beginning to understand. Every month, Marcus had to submit reports to the trust administrator about his volunteer work and professional development. Their father had essentially created a system to ensure his son's continued growth even from beyond the grave. Veso if you worry high shakot. It was on a rainy Thursday evening when everything shifted again. Sarah was working late at the foundation office when her phone rang. Marcus's voice was strained and unfamiliar. "Sarah, I need to see you. Tonight. It's about Dad, and it's important." She found him waiting in his small apartment, pacing by the window with a manila envelope clutched in his hands. The apartment was neat, but sparse, a far cry from the luxury he'd once taken for granted. On the coffee table were several documents spread out like pieces of a puzzle. "I've been doing research," Marcus said without preamble. "About Dad's business dealings, about the money, about everything. And I found something that changes everything we thought we knew. Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd kept the secret about his parentage for 3 years, and seeing him with those documents made her wonder if he'd somehow discovered the truth. "What kind of research?" she asked carefully. Marcus handed her a thick folder. "I hired a private investigator 6 months ago. I know that sounds crazy, but something about Dad's whole plan never made sense to me. The elaborate nature of it, the specific timing, the way he seemed to know exactly how I would react. It felt like he knew me too well, like he'd been studying me." Inside the folder were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized what she was looking at. Marcus had been investigating their father's activities in the years before his death, and he'd uncovered far more than just the inheritance manipulation. Dad wasn't just moving money around, Sarah. He was conducting some kind of long-term investigation into our family. Look at this. Marcus pulled out a photograph of their father sitting in a car outside a house Sarah didn't recognize. This was taken 2 years before he died. He was watching this house, this man. The photograph showed a middle-aged man with dark hair and brown eyes remarkably similar to Marcus's features. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what Marcus had stumbled upon. "Who is he?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "His name is David Castellano. He's a retired teacher, living about 2 hours from here. And, according to the investigator's report, Dad had been watching him for over a year." Marcus sat down heavily on his couch. "Sarah, I think this man might be my biological father." The room seemed to tilt. Sarah had spent 3 years protecting Marcus from this truth, and now he'd discovered it on his own through his determination to understand their father's motivations. "What makes you think that?" she managed to ask. Marcus pulled out more documents. "DNA testing. I found records that Dad had ordered DNA tests not just for himself, but for me too. The results are in here, and they show that we're not fully related. We share DNA through Mom, but not through Dad." Sarah watched her brother process this information in real time, saw the confusion and hurt playing across his features. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like relief. "I always felt different," Marcus continued quietly. "Not just physically, but in the way Dad treated me. He was proud of me, yes, but there was always this distance. Like he was trying too hard to connect with me. With you, everything was natural. You had his sense of humor, his way of thinking, his values. I always felt like I was performing, being his son." Sarah sat down beside him, her mind racing. "Marcus, even if this is true, Dad raised you. He loved you. You were his son in every way that mattered." "But that's just it," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "I don't think he saw it that way. I think he spent my entire life feeling like he was living a lie, and in the end, he couldn't handle it anymore. The inheritance plan wasn't just about teaching me a lesson or protecting you. It was about punishing me for not being his real son." The pain in his voice broke Sarah's heart. She realized that by keeping the secret, she'd allowed Marcus to discover it in the worst possible way, through his own investigation that had revealed not just the truth, but also evidence of their father's conflicted feelings about it. "There's more," Marcus said, pulling out another set of documents. "I went to see David Castellano last week." Sarah's eyes widened. "You did what?" "I had to know. I drove to his house and knocked on his door and told him who I was. And Sarah, he knew. He's known about me my entire life." Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain. "David told me that he and Mom had a relationship when she and Dad were separated. He said she chose to go back to Dad and never told him she was pregnant, but he figured it out when he saw my birth announcement in the newspaper 9 months later. He's been watching from a distance my whole life." This revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only had their mother kept this secret from their father for decades, but Marcus's biological father had known about him and chosen to stay away. "He seems like a good man," Marcus continued. "Quiet, thoughtful. He never married, never had other children. He said he always wondered about me, but respected Mom's choice to keep the family together. He showed me pictures he'd secretly taken over the years. Me at high school graduation, college, even at Dad's funeral. Sarah didn't know what to say. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Their father had died, carrying the burden of raising another man's child while that man watched from the shadows. Their mother had taken this secret to her grave, and Marcus had spent his life feeling like an outsider in his own family without understanding why. "But here's the thing that really gets me," Marcus said, turning back to face her. "David told me something that changes how I see everything Dad did. He said that about 4 years ago Dad came to see him." Sarah's jaw dropped. Dad knew about him? Not just knew about him. Dad went to David's house, and they had a long conversation. David said Dad was struggling with the knowledge about my parentage and wanted to understand who I really was, where I came from. They talked for hours about genetics, about nature versus nurture, about what it means to be a father. Marcus pulled out a handwritten letter from the folder. "David gave me this. It's a letter Dad wrote to him after that meeting but never sent." Sarah took the letter with trembling hands. Her father's familiar handwriting covered both sides of the page. "David, I want to thank you for the conversation we had yesterday. It helped me understand some things that have been troubling me for years. You asked me if I love Marcus, and the answer is yes, absolutely. But you also asked me if I've been fair to him, and that question has been keeping me at night. I realize now that I've spent 35 years expecting Marcus to be someone he isn't. I've tried to mold him into a version of myself, and when he didn't fit that mold, I assumed it was a character flaw rather than a fundamental difference in who he is. You were right when you said that he has your artistic sensibilities and your quieter approach to life. I've been pushing him toward business and law when he might have been happier teaching or working with his hands. But more than that, I've been punishing him for a lie that wasn't his fault. He didn't choose to be born into this deception. He's been trying his whole life to earn approval from a man who was holding him to impossible standards because I was angry at his mother for lying to me. Paikiniti Kaminusha? I've made a decision. I'm going to structure my estate in a way that forces both of my children to discover who they really are. Sarah has always known her worth, but she's never had the freedom to pursue her dreams because she's been too busy taking care of everyone else. Marcus has never had to struggle for anything, so he's never learned what he's truly capable of. I'm going to give Sarah the financial security to become the leader I know she can be. And I'm going to give Marcus the challenge he needs to find his own path, separate from my expectations. It won't be easy for either of them, but it's the only way I can think of to right the wrongs I've done as a father." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading. Their father's plan had been more complex and thoughtful than either of them had realized. It wasn't just about money or even about teaching lessons. It was about freeing both of his children from the roles he'd forced them into. "David said Dad visited him 2 more times before he died," Marcus continued. "The last time, he brought pictures of both of us and talked about how proud he was of the people we'd become despite his mistakes. He told David that he hoped someday I might want to meet my biological father, but that he understood if I didn't." Sarah looked at her brother, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The artistic sensibilities their father had mentioned were evident in the way Marcus had arranged his small apartment, in the watercolor paintings on the walls that she'd never really noticed before. The quieter approach to life was apparent in how he'd handled these revelations, methodically gathering information rather than exploding in anger. "How do you feel about all of this?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, relieved mostly. "It explains so much about my relationship with Dad, why I always felt like I was disappointing him, even when I was doing exactly what he wanted. And it explains why the inheritance plan felt so specifically designed to challenge me. He wasn't punishing me for not being his biological son. He was trying to help me figure out who I really am." He sat back down beside her. "But I'm also angry. Not at you, you don't need to look so worried. I can see from your reaction that you knew about this, and I understand why you didn't tell me. I'm angry at the situation, at the decades of deception, at the fact that 3 people I loved spent their entire lives carrying this secret." Sarah finally found her voice. "I found out the same day I went to the safety deposit box. Dad left me letters explaining everything. I've been struggling with whether to tell you for 3 years." "I'm glad you didn't," Marcus said, surprising her. I needed to discover this on my own terms, in my own way. If you had told me that day at the diner, I would have been crushed. I was already dealing with losing everything I thought was mine. Learning that my entire identity was a lie on top of that might have broken me completely. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the magnitude of what had been revealed. Finally, Marcus spoke again. I want to get to know David better. Not as a replacement for Dad, but as another piece of understanding who I am. And I want to pursue something I've been thinking about for a while. What's that? Teaching. Art therapy, specifically. Working with kids who are dealing with trauma or family issues. The volunteer work I've been doing at the legal clinic made me realize that I'm more interested in helping people heal than in legal technicalities. Sarah smiled. That sounds perfect for you. The trust fund Dad set up will cover living expenses while I go back to school. I think he would have approved, even if it's not the path he originally envisioned for me. Over the following months, Sarah watched Marcus transform in ways that had nothing to do with money or external circumstances. He enrolled in a graduate program for art therapy, moved to a small house near David Castellano, and began building a relationship with his biological father. The change in him was remarkable. The tension he'd carried his entire life seemed to dissolve as he embraced his true nature rather than fighting against it. David turned out to be a gentle, introspective man who had spent 40 years wondering about the son he'd never known. He and Marcus shared not just physical features but also a love of creating things with their hands, a preference for quiet contemplation over bold action, and a natural empathy that made them both excellent at understanding other people's emotional needs. Sarah found herself adjusting to having two father figures in her extended family. David was grateful to her for the kindness she'd shown Marcus throughout their lives, and he often said that her father had done a good job raising the son he'd never been allowed to know. The foundation Sarah had started grew significantly as she dedicated more time to it. She discovered that she had inherited not just her father's business acumen, but also his ability to see the big picture and plan for long-term impact. Within 2 years, the foundation was providing assistance to hundreds of families and had expanded to include educational programs about caregiving and end-of-life planning. But perhaps the most significant change came in her relationship with Marcus. For the first time in their lives, they interacted as equals, rather than as the favored daughter and the struggling son. They could talk honestly about their childhood experiences, acknowledging the ways their father's unconscious favoritism had shaped them both. I used to resent how easy everything seemed for you, Marcus admitted during one of their weekly dinners. You always knew exactly who you were and what you wanted, but I realize now that it wasn't really easier for you. You just had the security of knowing Dad's love was unconditional, which gave you the confidence to be yourself. Sarah had her own realizations. I used to think you had it made because Dad was so focused on your success. But that must have been exhausting, having to constantly prove yourself worthy of love. These conversations helped them understand not just each other, but also their father's complicated legacy. He'd been a flawed man who made mistakes based on his own pain and confusion, but he'd also been someone who ultimately wanted his children to be happy and authentic, even if he didn't always know how to encourage that. The biggest test of their new relationship came when Marcus graduated from his art therapy program and was offered a job at a treatment center for adolescents dealing with family trauma. The job was in another state, and Sarah realized she would miss him terribly. "Relaxin', you should take it," she told him without hesitation. "It's exactly what you're meant to do." "Are you sure? We've just figured out how to be a real family." "That's exactly why I'm sure. Real families support each other's dreams, even when it means being apart." On the day Marcus left for his new job, Sarah drove him to the airport. As they said goodbye, he handed her a small wrapped package. "What's this?" "Something I made for you. Open it later, when you get home." That evening, Sarah unwrapped the package to find a beautiful watercolor painting of their childhood home, but not as it had been when they lived there. Instead, Marcus had painted it as it might have looked in an ideal world, surrounded by gardens in full bloom, with warm light glowing from every window, and 2 children playing happily in the yard without any shadows of secrets or favoritism. On the back, he'd written, To Sarah, who taught me that family isn't about DNA or inheritances or even shared memories. It's about choosing to love someone and show up for them, over and over again. Thank you for choosing me as your brother, even when I didn't deserve it. Love, Marcus. Sarah hung the painting in her living room, where it served as a daily reminder that their father's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the lessons or even the truth about their family's complexities. His greatest gift had been forcing them to discover that love isn't diminished by secrets or mistakes, or even fundamental differences in biology. Love grows stronger when it's tested and chosen and renewed. Years later, when Sarah would tell this story to the families she worked with through her foundation, she would always end with the same observation. Sometimes the people who love us most hurt us the most, not because they're cruel, but because they're human. And sometimes the greatest act of love is creating circumstances that force growth, even when that growth is painful. Our Father gave us each other, but more importantly, He gave us the opportunity to choose each other, consciously and deliberately, as adults who understood the full complexity of what family really means. Marcus visited every few months, bringing stories of the young people he was helping and updates about his relationship with David. The treatment center where he worked had become nationally recognized for its innovative approach to family therapy, much of it based on Marcus's insights about the long-term effects of family secrets and conditional love. Sarah never married, but she built a rich life filled with meaningful work and chosen family. The foundation became her legacy, helping thousands of families navigate the complex emotional landscape of caregiving and loss. She often thought about the safety deposit box that had started it all, and how something that had initially seemed like such a small inheritance had actually contained the keys to understanding everything that really mattered. The house where they'd grown up was eventually bought by a family with 3 young children. Sometimes Sarah would drive by and see kids playing in the yard, and she would think about how every family has its secrets and struggles, but also its potential for redemption and growth. The new family didn't know the story of the people who had lived there before, but Sarah hoped they were creating their own story of love and understanding, one that would serve their children well when they faced their own challenges. On the 5th anniversary of their father's death, Sarah and Marcus met at his grave. They brought flowers, and also some of Marcus's art supplies, and together they created a small memorial piece right there in the cemetery. It was a mixed-media collage that incorporated photographs, pressed flowers, and words written in both of their handwriting. Beloved Father, flawed human, unexpected teacher. Thank you for loving us enough to let us find our own way. As they worked side by side in the peaceful cemetery, Sarah reflected on how their father's elaborate plan had ultimately succeeded beyond what he could have imagined. He'd wanted them to discover who they really were, and they had. He'd wanted them to appreciate what they had rather than taking it for granted, and they did. Most importantly, he'd wanted them to understand that family is about more than blood or money, or even shared history. It's about the daily choice to see the best in each other and to support each other's journey toward becoming who they're meant to be. The safety deposit box had been empty for years now, but its contents continued to shape their lives in ways both large and small. Every time Sarah made a difficult decision about the foundation, or Marcus worked with a particularly challenging case, they carried with them the lessons their father had embedded in his final gift. Love is complicated. Growth requires struggle. Truth is sometimes painful but always necessary. And family, real family, is strong enough to survive revelations that might destroy lesser bonds. On the day Marcus left for his new job, Sarah drove him to the airport. As they said goodbye, he handed her a small wrapped package. "What's this?" "Something I made for you. Open it later, when you get home." That evening, Sarah unwrapped the package to find a beautiful watercolor painting of their childhood home, but not as it had been when they lived there. Instead, Marcus had painted it as it might have looked in an ideal world, surrounded by gardens in full bloom, with warm light glowing from every window, and 2 children playing happily in the yard without any shadows of secrets or favoritism. On the back, he'd written, "To Sarah, who taught me that family isn't about DNA or inheritances or even shared memories. It's about choosing to love someone and show up for them, over and over again. Thank you for choosing me as your brother, even when I didn't deserve it. Love, Marcus. Sarah hung the painting in her living room, where it served as a daily reminder that their father's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the lessons or even the truth about their family's complexities. His greatest gift had been forcing them to discover that love isn't diminished by secrets or mistakes, or even fundamental differences in biology. Love grows stronger when it's tested and chosen and renewed. Years later, when Sarah would tell this story to the families she worked with through her foundation, she would always end with the same observation. Sometimes the people who love us most hurt us the most, not because they're cruel, but because they're human. And sometimes the greatest act of love is creating circumstances that force growth, even when that growth is painful. Our Father gave us each other, but more importantly, He gave us the opportunity to choose each other, consciously and deliberately, as adults who understood the full complexity of what family really means. Marcus visited every few months, bringing stories of the young people he was helping and updates about his relationship with David. The treatment center where he worked had become nationally recognized for its innovative approach to family therapy, much of it based on Marcus's insights about the long-term effects of family secrets and conditional love. Sarah never married, but she built a rich life filled with meaningful work and chosen family. The foundation became her legacy, helping thousands of families navigate the complex emotional landscape of caregiving and loss. She often thought about the safety deposit box that had started it all, and how something that had initially seemed like such a small inheritance had actually contained the keys to understanding everything that really mattered. The house where they'd grown up was eventually bought by a family with 3 young children. Sometimes Sarah would drive by and see kids playing in the yard, and she would think about how every family has its secrets and struggles, but also its potential for redemption and growth. The new family didn't know the story of the people who had lived there before, but Sarah hoped they were creating their own story of love and understanding, one that would serve their children well when they faced their own challenges. On the 5th anniversary of their father's death, Sarah and Marcus met at his grave. They brought flowers, and also some of Marcus's art supplies, and together they created a small memorial piece right there in the cemetery. It was a mixed-media collage that incorporated photographs, pressed flowers, and words written in both of their handwriting. Beloved Father, flawed human, unexpected teacher. Thank you for loving us enough to let us find our own way. As they worked side by side in the peaceful cemetery, Sarah reflected on how their father's elaborate plan had ultimately succeeded beyond what he could have imagined. He'd wanted them to discover who they really were, and they had. He'd wanted them to appreciate what they had rather than taking it for granted, and they did. Most importantly, he'd wanted them to understand that family is about more than blood or money, or even shared history. It's about the daily choice to see the best in each other and to support each other's journey toward becoming who they're meant to be. The safety deposit box had been empty for years now, but its contents continued to shape their lives in ways both large and small. Every time Sarah made a difficult decision about the foundation, or Marcus worked with a particularly challenging case, they carried with them the lessons their father had embedded in his final gift. Love is complicated. Growth requires struggle. Truth is sometimes painful but always necessary. And family, real family, is strong enough to survive revelations that might destroy lesser bonds. Walking away from the cemetery that day, Sarah realized that she was no longer angry about the will or the secrets or even the years of confusion and pain. Their father had given them something more valuable than money or property. He'd given them the chance to choose love consciously, with full knowledge of each other's flaws and strengths. And that choice, made and renewed again and again over the years, had created a bond stronger than any biological connection could have been. The story that had begun with what seemed like a betrayal had become a testament to the power of intentional love and chosen family. And Sarah knew that wherever their father was, he would be proud of the people they had become, and the relationship they had built on the foundation of his final, most complex gift. The story that had begun with what seemed like a betrayal had become a testament to the power of intentional love and chosen family. And Sarah knew that wherever their father was, He would be proud of the people they had become and the relationship they had built on the foundation of his final, most complex gift. 8 years had passed since that rainy evening when Marcus had confronted Sarah with his investigation into their family's secrets. The foundation Sarah had built had grown into a nationally recognized organization, and Marcus's innovative approach to family therapy had earned him invitations to speak at conferences around the country. But it was a phone call on a Tuesday morning in October that would open yet another chapter in their ongoing story. "Sarah, you need to sit down." Marcus's voice was urgent but not panicked. "I just got a call from David's neighbor. He's in the hospital." Sarah's heart sank. David Castellano had become like a second father to both of them over the years, a gentle presence who had helped Marcus understand parts of himself that had been mysteries for decades. At 72, David had been in good health, but the years were catching up with him. "What happened?" "Heart attack. He's stable, but they're not sure about long-term damage yet. I'm driving there now." Sarah immediately arranged for coverage at the foundation and drove the 2 hours to the small town where David lived. She found Marcus in the hospital waiting room, sitting next to a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and Marcus's same dark eyes. "Sarah, this is Elena Castellano," Marcus said, standing as she approached. "David's sister." Sarah shook Elena's hand, noting the family resemblance not just to David but to Marcus as well. "I didn't know David had a sister." Elena smiled sadly. "He's always been private about family matters. But when the hospital called me as his emergency contact, I knew I had to meet the young man he's been talking about for the past few years. He's very proud of you both." As they sat together waiting for news about David's condition, Elena began sharing stories about their family that neither Sarah nor Marcus had heard before. She told them about their grandparents' immigration from Italy, about David's artistic talents that had been discouraged by their traditional parents, and about the profound sadness he'd carried for decades after learning about Marcus's existence. "He never told you this," Elena said to Marcus, "but he used to drive by your school sometimes when you were little, just to catch a glimpse of you. He kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about your achievements. He was so proud when you graduated from law school, even though he knew you'd never know he was celebrating." The revelation hit Marcus hard. "He was watching me even then?" "Not in a creepy way," Elena assured him quickly. "More like a guardian angel. He respected your parents' choice to keep the family together, but he couldn't help caring about you from a distance." When David was finally stable enough for visitors, he looked smaller and frailer than either of them had seen him before, but his eyes lit up when he saw them together. "My two favorite people," he said weakly. "And Elena too. This is like a dream come true, having all my family in one place." Over the next few days, as David recovered, Sarah found herself learning more about this extended family she'd never known existed. Elena had children and grandchildren who lived across the country, cousins Marcus had never met who shared his artistic abilities and quiet temperament. It was like discovering an entire branch of family that had been hidden from view. But more importantly, she watched Marcus step into a caregiving role with David that mirrored her own experience with their father. He took leave from his job to stay near the hospital, coordinated with doctors, and made sure David had everything he needed. The reversal wasn't lost on either of them. "You're getting a chance to do this right," Sarah told him one evening as they sat in David's hospital room while he slept. "To be present for someone you love in a way that Dad never let you be present for him." Marcus nodded. "It's strange how life gives you these opportunities to heal old wounds in new ways." David's recovery was slow but steady. During the long hours at the hospital, he began sharing more stories about his life, including ones about Sarah and Marcus's mother that cast their family history in an even more complex light. "Your mother was extraordinary," David told them one afternoon. "People always talked about how beautiful she was, but that wasn't what drew me to her. She had this way of seeing right into people's hearts and understanding what they needed. She knew your father needed to feel like he was taking care of his family, so she let him believe that leaving me and going back to him was about choosing security over passion." He paused, struggling with the oxygen tubes that helped his breathing. "But the truth was, she could see that I wasn't ready to be a father. I was 25 and barely knew who I was myself. She knew that your father, for all his flaws, would give Marcus the structure and opportunities that I couldn't provide at that time in my life. This perspective reframed everything Sarah thought she knew about her mother's choice. Rather than a woman torn between two men, their mother had been someone making a calculated decision about what would be best for her unborn child. She came to see me once, when Marcus was about 5, David continued. She brought pictures and told me about his personality, his interests, his struggles in school. She said she wanted me to know that he was a good boy, and that someday, if I ever had the chance to be part of his life, I should take it. Marcus had tears in his eyes. She knew you might want to meet me someday? She hoped for it. She said that Marcus would need to understand all the different parts of himself as he got older, and that I represented parts of him that your father couldn't understand or nurture. As David's health improved enough for him to return home, Sarah found herself facing a decision she hadn't anticipated. Elena had suggested that David shouldn't be living alone anymore, and Marcus was torn between his work in another state and his desire to be nearby to help care for his biological father. What if he moved closer to us? Sarah suggested. There are excellent assisted living communities near the foundation. He could maintain his independence, but have support when he needs it. The idea sparked something in Marcus that Sarah hadn't seen before. What if we did more than that? What if we created something specifically for people like David? Artists, creative people who are aging and need community. Over the following months, Sarah and Marcus began developing an ambitious new project. Using a combination of foundation resources and Marcus's connections in the art therapy world, they designed a residential community that would serve as both assisted living for older adults and a training ground for young people pursuing careers in art therapy and elder care. The project brought them back to their hometown, where they purchased several acres of land not far from their childhood home. The community they built was unlike anything either of them had imagined when they first inherited their father's complex legacy. David became the first resident and unofficial artistic director of what they called the Generations Center. Elena moved from across the country to be closer to her brother and became the community's activities coordinator. Marcus took a position as the center's clinical director, finally combining his legal background, his art therapy training, and his personal experience with family secrets into a unique approach to helping people heal from lifelong wounds. Sarah discovered that running the center alongside the foundation gave her a sense of purpose that pure philanthropy hadn't provided. She loved watching the relationships that developed between the older residents and the young students who came to learn from them. She loved seeing how Marcus thrived in an environment where his gentle nature and artistic sensibilities were not just accepted but celebrated. But perhaps the most unexpected development came when they decided to create a documentary about the center's philosophy and approach. The filmmaker they hired was a young woman named Jessica Chen, who became fascinated not just with the center's work, but with the story of how Sarah and Marcus had come to create it. "Your father's inheritance plan is like something out of a novel," Jessica said during one of their planning meetings. "But the way you've transformed that experience into something that helps other people heal from family trauma is remarkable. Would you be willing to include your personal story in the documentary?" Sarah and Marcus looked at each other uncertainly. They'd never spoken publicly about their family's secrets or their father's elaborate final plan, but they realized that their story might help other families navigate similar complexities. The documentary, titled The Inheritance of Love, was released 3 years later and became an unexpected success. It told the story of the Generations Center through the lens of Sarah and Marcus's journey, showing how family secrets and painful revelations could be transformed into sources of healing and connection. The film's impact was far greater than either of them had anticipated. They began receiving letters from families around the country who had watched the documentary and found courage to address their own secrets and unresolved conflicts. Support groups formed around the country using the film's themes as starting points for difficult conversations about family dynamics and conditional love. One letter particularly moved Sarah. It was from a woman named Patricia, whose family had been torn apart by a similar situation involving paternity and inheritance. "Your story gave me hope that it's never too late to choose love over resentment," Patricia wrote. "My brother and I hadn't spoken in 15 years, because of our father's will and some secrets that came to light after his death. But watching your documentary made me realize that we were letting our father's mistakes continue to hurt us long after he was gone. I called my brother yesterday, and we talked for 4 hours. We're planning to meet next month." Stories like Patricia's convinced Sarah and Marcus that their father's legacy had grown far beyond what he could have imagined. His complex plan had not only transformed their relationship, but had given them the tools and motivation to help other families heal from similar wounds. The success of the documentary also brought unexpected recognition to the Generations Center. They began receiving funding from organizations around the country that wanted to replicate their model. Marcus found himself traveling regularly to help other communities develop similar programs, while Sarah focused on scaling the foundation's work to support these new initiatives. But success brought its own challenges. As the center and foundation grew, Sarah and Marcus found themselves busier than ever, with less time for the quiet moments of connection that had rebuilt their relationship. It was David who pointed this out during one of their weekly dinners at the center. "You two are working so hard to help other families that you're forgetting to nurture your own," he observed gently. "Your father would be proud of what you've built, but he'd also want you to remember that the relationship between you is the foundation everything else is built on." His words were a wake-up call. Sarah and Marcus began instituting regular time together that wasn't about work or planning or problem-solving. They started taking annual trips together, just the two of them, to places that had no connection to their family history or their professional responsibilities. On one such trip to a cabin in the mountains, they were sitting by a fire when Marcus brought up something that had been on his mind for months. "I've been thinking about having children," he said quietly. "Not in the traditional way necessarily, but maybe adopting or becoming a foster parent. There are so many kids in the system who need families, and I feel like we have something unique to offer." Sarah felt a surge of emotion at the idea. "You'd be an amazing father. You have so much wisdom about what kids need to feel truly loved and accepted. I'd want you to be involved too, as an aunt, as a chosen family member. I don't want to raise children in isolation the way our parents did." The conversation opened up new possibilities for both of them. Over the following year, Marcus began the process of becoming a foster parent, while Sarah explored ways the foundation could support foster families and adopted children. They realized that their own experience of chosen family had prepared them to help children who needed to understand that love isn't limited by biology or traditional family structures. Marcus's first foster placement was a 7-year-old boy named Alex, whose parents had struggled with addiction. Alex had been in several foster homes and had difficulty trusting adult caregivers. But Marcus's patient, artistic approach to building relationship slowly broke through the boy's defenses. Sarah watched her brother transform yet again, as he learned to parent. All the gentleness and creativity that their father had sometimes seen as weaknesses became Marcus's greatest strengths in caring for a traumatized child. Alex began to flourish under Marcus's care, discovering his own artistic abilities and learning that adults could be reliable sources of support and encouragement. When Alex's case moved toward adoption after his parents were unable to overcome their addictions, Marcus didn't hesitate to pursue permanent custody. The adoption was finalized on a spring day that Sarah declared should become an annual family holiday. "You know what this means," she told Marcus as they left the courthouse with Alex, who was clutching a new set of art supplies Sarah had given him to commemorate the day. "Dad has a grandson now." Alex looked up at them with curious eyes. "Tell me about my grandpa again." It had become one of Alex's favorite stories, the tale of the grandfather he'd never met, who had left behind a puzzle that brought his new family together. Sarah and Marcus had simplified the story for a 7-year-old, focusing on the themes of love and second chances and the importance of never giving up on family. Grandpa was a man who made mistakes but who loved his children so much that he found a way to help them even after he was gone, Marcus told Alex as they drove home. "And one of the ways he helped was by making sure that Aunt Sarah and I would be here, together, when you needed a family." That evening, as Sarah tucked Alex into bed in his new permanent bedroom, he asked her a question that took her breath away. "Aunt Sarah, do you think Grandpa knew about me? Do you think he planned for me to be part of the family too?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Their father had been a man who thought in long-term patterns, who understood that actions ripple forward in ways that can't always be predicted. Had he somehow known that his complex inheritance plan would eventually lead to this moment, with a formerly neglected child finding safety and love in the family he'd worked so hard to preserve and heal? I think Grandpa understood that when you heal a family, it becomes strong enough to help heal other people too, she told Alex. And I think he would be very, very proud of the family we've all chosen to become. As she turned off Alex's light and walked downstairs to where Marcus was grading papers from his part-time teaching job at the local university, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with what seemed like a devastating betrayal in a lawyer's office nearly a decade ago. The safety deposit box had contained much more than letters and legal documents. It had contained the seeds of transformation that had grown into something none of them could have imagined. Their father's final gift hadn't just been money or even lessons about struggle and growth. It had been the demonstration that love is strong enough to survive secrets, complex enough to encompass multiple truths, and generous enough to expand to include whoever needs to be included. Alex's question about whether their father had planned for him reminded Sarah of something David had said shortly after his heart attack. He'd been reflecting on the chain of events that had brought their unconventional family together, and he'd made an observation that had stuck with her. "Maybe the point isn't whether your father planned all of this," David had said. "Maybe the point is that he created the conditions for love to keep growing, even after he was gone. He gave you and Marcus the tools to build something bigger than just yourselves." Looking around the living room of the house she now shared with Marcus and Alex, Sarah could see evidence of that continuing growth everywhere. There were Alex's drawings on the refrigerator, photos from Generation Center events on the mantelpiece, and letters from families who had been helped by the Foundation's programs scattered across the coffee table. Their father had wanted his children to discover who they really were and what they were capable of becoming. Sarah had discovered that she was a leader who could turn personal pain into institutional healing. Marcus had discovered that he was a nurturer who could help others find their authentic selves. And together, they had discovered that chosen family could be even stronger than biological family when it was built on conscious decision rather than obligation. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned that inheritance isn't just about what gets passed down from one generation to the next. It's also about what gets created new in each generation, what gets healed and transformed and passed forward to people who weren't even born when the original gifts were given. As Sarah joined Marcus at the kitchen table where he was working, she thought about all the lives that had been touched by their father's complex final plan. David, who had finally gotten to know the son he'd watched from a distance for 40 years. Elena, who had reconnected with her brother and found a new extended family. Alex, who had found permanent love and stability after years of uncertainty. The hundreds of families who had been helped by the Foundation's programs. The elderly residents and young students at the Generation Center who had found community and purpose together. And thousands more people they would never meet who had watched their documentary or heard their story and found the courage to have difficult conversations with their own families, to forgive old hurts, to choose love over resentment. "Do you ever wonder what Dad would think of all this?" Marcus asked, looking up from the papers he was grading. "Ah." Sarah smiled. "I think he'd be amazed. But I also think he'd say that this is exactly what he hoped would happen when he forced us to discover who we really are." "And what do you think we've discovered?" Sarah looked around their home, thought about the work they did, the people they'd chosen to love and be loved by. "I think we've discovered that the best inheritance anyone can leave is the courage to love without conditions, and the wisdom to know that family is something you build, not something you're just born into." Upstairs, Alex called out that he needed another glass of water, and Marcus got up to tend to him. Sarah heard their voices, Marcus reading another chapter of the book they were working through together, Alex asking questions about the story, and about his day at school, and about plans for the weekend. It was such an ordinary moment, but Sarah recognized it as the culmination of everything their father had set in motion with his elaborate plan. This was what he had been trying to create. A family based on choice and presence and daily acts of love rather than obligation or expectation or biological connection. The safety deposit box was long empty, but its contents continued to generate new possibilities with each passing year. And Sarah knew that this was how the best inheritances work. They don't just provide for one generation, but create the foundation for ongoing growth and healing that ripples forward through time in ways that can never be fully measured or predicted. Their story had begun with an ending, with their father's death and the shocking contents of his will. But Sarah now understood that it was really a story about beginnings, about the courage to start over and build something new from the pieces of what came before. Every day brought new opportunities to extend that legacy of chosen love to others who needed to discover that family is not a limitation, but a liberation, not a burden, but a gift that keeps growing larger the more generously it's shared. Their story had begun with an ending, with their father's death and the shocking contents of his will. But Sarah now understood that it was really a story about beginnings, about the courage to start over and build something new from the pieces of what came before. Every day brought new opportunities to extend that legacy of chosen love to others, who needed to discover that family is not a limitation but a liberation, not a burden, but a gift that keeps growing larger the more generously it's shared. 3 years after Alex's adoption, Sarah received a phone call that would once again challenge everything they thought they understood about their family's story. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and she was reviewing grant applications at the foundation when her assistant knocked on her door. "There's a woman on the phone who says she's calling about your father's estate. She won't give me details, but she seems upset and says it's urgent." Sarah's stomach dropped. Their father had been dead for over a decade, and all legal matters related to his estate had been settled years ago. She picked up the phone with a sense of dread. "This is Sarah Morrison." "Ms. Morrison, my name is Catherine Wells. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Margaret Chen. She passed away last month, and in going through her papers, we discovered some documents that relate to your family. I think you need to see them." Sarah's mind raced. She didn't recognize the name Margaret Chen, though the surname reminded her of Mrs. Chen, the bank manager who had helped her access the safety deposit box all those years ago. "What kind of documents?" "I'd rather not discuss this over the phone. Could you come to my office? And Ms. Morrison, you might want to bring your brother. These documents concern him as well." 2 days later, Sarah and Marcus sat in Catherine Wells's law office, Alex coloring quietly in a corner chair while the adults tried to process what they were hearing. Margaret Chen had indeed been Mrs. Chen from the bank, but she had also been much more than that. "Mrs. Chen was your father's accountant for over 20 years, Catherine explained, spreading documents across her conference table. "But according to these papers, she was also much more than that. She was his closest confidant, and the person who helped him plan not just the inheritance scheme you discovered, but several other projects." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet. "What kind of projects?" Catherine handed them a thick folder. "Your father apparently spent the last 10 years of his life identifying and secretly helping families who were dealing with situations similar to yours. Families torn apart by inheritance disputes, by secrets about parentage, by the kind of painful revelations that destroy relationships." Marcus looked up from the papers he was reading. He was helping other families? More than helping. He was creating elaborate scenarios designed to force healing and reconciliation. "Mrs. Chen has detailed records of at least 15 families that your father intervened with, always anonymously, always through complex arrangements that made it appear as though circumstances rather than human planning were bringing about resolution." Sarah's hands trembled as she read through case files that detailed stories remarkably similar to their own. A family in Oregon where a disputed will had led to estrangement between siblings, until a series of forced them to work together and ultimately discover their father's hidden motivations. A family in Texas where a long-kept secret about adoption had poisoned relationships for decades, until an anonymous benefactor funded family therapy that helped them heal. "Why are you telling us this now?" Sarah asked. Catherine pulled out another document. "Because Mrs. Chen left instructions that you should be told about this work after her death, and she left you something. She believed you and your brother had not only successfully navigated your father's plan, but had taken it further than he ever imagined. She thought you might want to continue his work." The something turned out to be a substantial endowment. enough to fund a new branch of Sarah's foundation dedicated specifically to helping families heal from inheritance-related trauma and family secrets. But more than that, Mrs. Chen had left detailed files on dozens of families who had contacted her over the years, people who had heard rumors about someone who could help with family healing but had never been able to access that help. Your father called it his legacy project, Catherine explained. He believed that most family dysfunction stemmed from secrets and inequitable treatment of children, and he thought that with the right intervention at the right time, even the most damaged relationships could be healed. As they drove home from the lawyer's office, Alex asked the question that was on all their minds. So Grandpa was like a secret superhero for families? Marcus smiled at his son's interpretation. Something like that, buddy. But Sarah was struggling with more complex emotions. Learning about her father's secret mission felt overwhelming rather than inspiring. How many families had he manipulated without their knowledge? How many elaborate schemes had he orchestrated? And what gave him the right to interfere in other people's lives, even if his intentions were good? Over dinner that night, she voiced these concerns to Marcus and David, who had joined them for their weekly family meal. "I'm having trouble with this," she admitted. "Dad's plan for us was painful, but ultimately helpful. But the idea that he was doing this to other families, manipulating their lives without their knowledge, it feels wrong." David, now in his late 70s but still sharp, considered her words carefully. "I think the question isn't whether your father had the right to intervene," he said finally. "The question is whether the interventions helped. And if they did, whether you want to continue that work in a more ethical way." "What do you mean?" "Your father worked in secret because he thought people wouldn't accept help if they knew it was being offered. But you've built something different. You've created institutions that people come to willingly. Maybe the next step is to offer the kind of help your father provided, but openly and with consent." Marcus had been quiet during this conversation, but now he spoke up. "I've been thinking about something Mrs. Chen mentioned. She said dozens of families had contacted her looking for help. What if we created a program specifically for families dealing with inheritance trauma and secrets? Not secret intervention, but open support for people who want help healing these kinds of wounds?" The idea grew over the following weeks as they read through more of Mrs. Chen's files. The stories were heartbreaking but also inspiring. Siblings who hadn't spoken in decades because of perceived favoritism in a parent's will. Adult children who had discovered they were adopted and felt betrayed by lifelong deception. Families torn apart by business succession disputes that were really about love and recognition and the feeling of being valued. Sarah realized that their own story, while unique in its details, was actually part of a much larger pattern of family dysfunction rooted in poor communication and inequitable treatment of children. Their father had been trying to address a widespread problem, but he'd been doing it one family at a time through elaborate secret schemes. "What if we could scale this?" she asked Marcus one evening as they reviewed the case files. "What if we created a systematic approach to helping families heal from these kinds of wounds?" They began developing what they called the Family Legacy Institute, a comprehensive program that would offer everything from mediation services for inheritance disputes to family therapy for dealing with secrets and lies. Unlike their father's secret interventions, the Institute would work only with families who actively sought help. The program's first test case came sooner than expected. A woman named Jennifer Martinez contacted the foundation after hearing about their work through the documentary. Her family was being torn apart by a dispute over her mother's will, which had left everything to Jennifer's brother while giving her only personal effects and a small savings account. "It's exactly like what happened to you," Jennifer said during their first meeting, "except my brother isn't interested in sharing or making things fair. He's already sold the family home and moved the money into accounts I can't access. But the worst part is, I don't understand why Mom did this. We had a good relationship. I thought she loved me." Sarah recognized the pain in Jennifer's voice as an echo of her own feelings from over a decade ago. But she also recognized an opportunity to help in a way that was direct and honest, rather than manipulative. Working with Jennifer's family took 6 months of careful mediation, therapy sessions, and investigation into the mother's motivations. What they discovered was a pattern that had become familiar. A parent who had unconsciously favored one child over another, then tried to compensate with an inheritance plan that actually made things worse. But unlike Sarah's father's approach, the Family Legacy Institute's method involved bringing all family members into the process voluntarily. Jennifer's brother initially resisted, but when he realized that the goal wasn't to take away his inheritance, but to heal the family relationships, he became an active participant. The breakthrough came when they discovered that Jennifer's mother had actually left a series of letters explaining her reasoning, hidden in a safety deposit box that no one had known about. The letters revealed that the mother had perceived Jennifer as the stronger, more capable daughter who didn't need financial support, while the brother had struggled with addiction and unemployment and seemed to need more help. She wasn't playing favorites, the family therapist they worked with explained to both siblings. She was trying to give each of you what she thought you needed, but she didn't communicate her reasoning, so it felt like rejection rather than love. The resolution wasn't perfect, but it was real. Jennifer's brother agreed to share part of the inheritance, and more importantly, both siblings gained understanding of their mother's motivations and began rebuilding their relationship. A year later, Jennifer sent Sarah a photo of her and her brother at his one-year sobriety celebration, with a note that said, "Thank you for giving us back our family." The success of Jennifer's case led to more referrals, and within 2 years, the Family Legacy Institute was working with dozens of families across the country. Each case was different, but Sarah began to see patterns in the types of family dysfunction that led to inheritance trauma. Parents who failed to communicate their love equally to all their children. Parents who made assumptions about what their children needed without asking. Parents who used inheritance as a way to control behavior or express disappointment. Children who internalized their parents' unconscious favoritism and carried those wounds into adulthood. But she also saw patterns in what led to healing. Honest communication about family history and parental motivations. Recognition that parents, like all people, were flawed and made mistakes based on their own wounds and limitations. The willingness of family members to see each other as complex human beings rather than simply as sources of hurt or support. The work was emotionally demanding, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Sarah found herself thinking often about her father's secret mission and how it had evolved into something more transparent and collaborative. She wondered if he would approve of the changes they'd made to his approach. The answer came in an unexpected way during Alex's 10th birthday party. They were celebrating at the Generation Center, with residents and staff joining the family celebration. Alex had invited several friends from school, and the mix of children and elderly adults created exactly the kind of intergenerational community that had become the center's signature. During the party, Sarah overheard Alex explaining to one of his friends why his family was different from most families. "My dad adopted me, and my Aunt Sarah isn't married, but she's like a mom to me too," Alex was saying. "And my Grandpa David isn't my real grandpa, but he loves me like one. And I have another grandpa who died before I was born, but he left us all these puzzles to solve that helped us become a family." The friend looked confused. "That sounds complicated." Alex considered this seriously. "It is complicated. But Aunt Sarah says that the best families are complicated because they're made of people who choose to love each other, not just people who have to love each other because they're related." Hearing her words reflected back through Alex's understanding, Sarah realized that her father's legacy had evolved far beyond his original plan. He had wanted to heal his own family's wounds, but in doing so, he had created a model for helping other families heal as well. The Family Legacy Institute's work had expanded to include not just inheritance disputes, but also family secrets of all kinds. They worked with families dealing with adoption revelations, infidelity discoveries, financial deceptions, and the countless other ways that hidden truths could poison relationships across generations. Marcus had developed a specialization in working with children and adolescents who were caught in the middle of family conflicts. His own experience of growing up feeling like an outsider in his own family had given him unique insights into how children internalize family dysfunction and how they could be helped to develop healthier relationships with their identity and self-worth. "The thing I try to help kids understand," Marcus explained to Sarah one evening as they reviewed cases, "is that their parents' problems aren't their fault or their responsibility to fix. But They can choose how to respond to those problems in ways that either perpetuate the dysfunction or break the cycle. Sarah had seen this principle at work in Alex's development. Despite coming from a background of trauma and neglect, Alex was growing into a confident, empathetic child who understood that families could be created through intention and care, rather than just biology. He had internalized the lesson that love was something you demonstrated through actions, rather than something you assumed based on relationships. But perhaps the most profound impact of their work came through the stories that families shared with them about how healing had rippled through their lives. Children who grew up in families that had learned to communicate honestly about difficult topics became adults who were better equipped to handle their own relationship challenges. Siblings who had reconciled after years of estrangement often became closer than they had ever been before, their relationships strengthened by having survived and overcome serious conflict. One letter that particularly moved Sarah came from a woman whose family had worked with the Institute 5 years earlier. "You helped my sister and me heal from our father's favoritism and the resentment we'd carried for decades," the woman wrote. "But the real gift was watching how that healing affected our own children. My daughter just got engaged, and she told me that watching her aunt and me work through our problems taught her that relationships are worth fighting for, that love means having difficult conversations rather than avoiding them. She said she wants to build her marriage on the foundation of honest communication that she saw us create." Reading letters like this, Sarah understood that her father's legacy had become something much larger than he could have imagined. He had wanted to heal his own family's wounds, but in doing so, he had sparked a kind of healing that was spreading through generations and across families he would never know about. The work also brought unexpected personal rewards. Sarah found herself in a relationship with Dr. James Wu, a family therapist who had joined the Institute staff. Their relationship had grown slowly from professional collaboration to personal friendship to something deeper, based on shared values and mutual respect rather than passion or convenience. James understood the complexities of Sarah's family in ways that previous partners had not. He appreciated the intentional nature of the relationships she had built, and wanted to become part of that chosen family structure, rather than trying to replace it with something more traditional. When James proposed, he did it at a family dinner with Marcus, Alex, and David present, acknowledging that marrying Sarah meant joining a family that extended far beyond just the two of them. "I'm not just asking you to marry me," he said, getting down on one knee in their living room. "I'm asking to become part of this extraordinary family you've all created together." The wedding was held at the Generations Center, with residents and staff joining friends and colleagues in celebrating not just Sarah and James's union, but the continuation of a family story that had begun with secrets and betrayal, but had grown into something beautiful and generous. Alex served as ring bearer, proudly wearing a suit that David had helped him pick out. Marcus gave a speech about how Sarah had taught him that family was something you built rather than something you inherited, and how James was a perfect addition to their ongoing construction project. But it was David's toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. At 81, he had become the patriarch of their unconventional family, and his words carried the weight of someone who had watched love triumph over secrets and resentment. "I've lived long enough to see that there are many different ways to build a family," he said, raising his glass. "But the best families, like this one, are built on the foundation of choosing each other every day. Sarah and James, may your marriage be the beginning of many more chapters in this beautiful story of chosen love." As Sarah danced with James at their reception, surrounded by the family she had helped create and the community they had built together, she thought about the safety deposit box that had started it all. The contents had long since been absorbed into their daily lives, but the principle behind them continued to generate new possibilities. Her father had left her what seemed like the smallest inheritance, but had actually been the largest. The understanding that love was not diminished by complexity, but strengthened by it. That family was not limited by biology, but expanded by intention, and that the best legacies were not preserved but transformed, growing larger and more generous with each generation that chose to embrace them. The Family Legacy Institute was now helping hundreds of families each year, and requests for their services came from around the world. They had trained therapists and mediators in dozens of cities to use their approach, and the documentary about their work had been translated into 15 languages. But Sarah's proudest moment came during Alex's high school graduation speech, when he was chosen as valedictorian to address his graduating class. "People always ask me about my family because it's different from most families," Alex said from the podium. "I tell them that my family taught me that the most important inheritance anyone can receive is not money or property, but the knowledge that you are worthy of love and capable of creating love wherever you go. My grandfather, who died before I was born, left my family a puzzle that taught them this lesson. And they've spent my entire life teaching it to me and to hundreds of other families who needed to learn it too." He paused, looking out at the audience that included not just his classmates and their families, but also residents from the Generations Center, staff from the Family Legacy Institute, and families who had been helped by their programs. "The best inheritance isn't something you receive," Alex concluded. "It's something you create and pass forward. And I plan to spend my life adding to the legacy of love that my family has built, making it bigger and stronger and more inclusive with each generation." Sitting in the audience, Sarah felt the profound satisfaction of seeing her father's complex final gift continuing to generate new possibilities through Alex's understanding of it. The safety deposit box had been empty for over 15 years, but its contents continued to create value that could never be measured in dollars or counted in assets. That evening, as their extended family gathered for Alex's graduation celebration, Sarah looked around the room at the people who had become part of their story. Marcus and his biological father David, whose relationship had healed decades of separation and regret. James, who had chosen to join their family's mission of healing others. Elena and her children and grandchildren, who had become part of their extended clan. The staff and residents of the Generations Center, who had created a community based on chosen connection rather than biological obligation. And Alex, now 18, and preparing to start college, where he planned to study social work and continue the family tradition of helping others heal from trauma and loss. "You know what I think Dad would say if he could see all this?" Marcus asked, following her gaze around the room. Sarah smiled. "I think he'd say that the best investment he ever made was in teaching us that love grows larger when it's shared, not smaller. And I think he'd be amazed that a safety deposit box could contain the seeds of all this." Sarah laughed. "I don't think the safety deposit box contained the seeds. I think we contained the seeds. The box just contained the key to helping us grow." As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Sarah realized that their story was no longer about discovering their father's final gift. It had become about creating their own gifts to pass forward, about taking the lessons they had learned and transforming them into something that could help others for generations to come. The inheritance that had begun with secrets and betrayal had become a legacy of healing and hope. And Sarah knew that as long as there were families struggling with the complexities of love and loss, secrets and forgiveness, her father's final gift would continue to generate new possibilities for connection and understanding. The safety deposit box was empty, but its contents had filled their lives and the lives of countless others with something more valuable than money. The knowledge that family is not a limitation but a liberation, and that the best inheritance anyone can leave is the courage to choose love, again and again, even when it's difficult, even when it's complicated, even when it requires letting go of old hurts and embracing new possibilities. The inheritance that had begun with secrets and betrayal had become a legacy of healing and hope. And Sarah knew that as long as there were families struggling with the complexities of love and loss, secrets and forgiveness, her father's final gift would continue to generate new possibilities for connection and understanding. 25 years later, Sarah stood in another lawyer's office, but this time she was there by choice rather than obligation. At 71, she was preparing to establish her own legacy plan, and the irony of the situation was not lost on her. Beside her sat Alex, now 43, and the director of the Family Legacy Institute, and his own daughter Emma, a bright 16-year-old who had grown up understanding that families were built through intention and love, rather than accident and obligation. The lawyer, a young woman named Dr. Lisa Park, was actually a former client whose family had been helped by the Institute 15 years earlier. She had gone on to specialize in estate planning that focused on healing rather than creating conflict. "This is quite different from most estate plans I handle," Dr. Park said, reviewing the documents Sarah had prepared. Most people focus on distributing assets. You've created a plan focused on distributing wisdom. Sarah had indeed taken a different approach. Rather than simply leaving money to her heirs, she had created a complex educational trust that would provide funding for family healing programs, while also challenging each generation to expand and improve upon the work. I learned from my father's example, Sarah explained. The most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's the opportunity to discover who you really are and what you're capable of becoming. The plan she had developed would provide Alex and Emma with substantial financial security, but it would also require them to actively participate in the Family Legacy Institute's mission. Each generation would inherit both resources and responsibility, ensuring that the work of helping families heal would continue long after Sarah was gone. But the most innovative part of Sarah's plan was what she called the Safety Deposit Box Protocol. Every 10 years, the trust would require the inheritors to create new programs or approaches based on emerging family healing needs, with the results documented and stored for future generations to build upon. It's like a puzzle that keeps generating new puzzles, Alex explained to Emma as they walked to the car after the meeting. Grandma Sarah learned that the best legacies don't just preserve the past, they create tools for the future. Emma, who had inherited her great-grandfather's analytical mind, along with Marcus's artistic sensibilities, was already thinking about how she might contribute to the legacy when her time came. I've been thinking about virtual reality therapy for families who can't physically be together, she said. And I assisted mediation for inheritance disputes. Technology could help us reach families we could never help before. Sarah smiled, hearing echoes of conversations she'd had with Marcus decades earlier about expanding their father's work. Each generation brought new perspectives and possibilities to the mission, ensuring that it remained relevant and effective. That evening, the three generations gathered at the Old Generation Center for their monthly family dinner. The center had grown into a network of communities across the country, but the original location remained special to their family. Marcus, now in his 70s, still lived in a cottage on the grounds and continued to work part-time as a consultant for new art therapy programs. David had passed away peacefully 5 years earlier, at the age of 86, surrounded by the family he had never expected to have. His final gift had been a series of paintings depicting the journey their family had taken from secrets and separation to love and connection. The paintings hung in the center's main hallway, a visual reminder of the power of chosen family. Nika. As they sat around the familiar dinner table, Alex raised a toast. To Grandpa's safety deposit box, which taught us that the best inheritances are the ones that keep giving. And to all the families who trusted us to help them find their way back to each other, Marcus added. Emma, wise beyond her years, had the final word. And to the families we haven't met yet, who are going to teach us new things about what love and healing can look like. After dinner, Sarah walked alone through the center's gardens, thinking about the incredible journey that had begun with her father's death over 3 decades ago. The young woman who had sat in that lawyer's office feeling betrayed and abandoned could never have imagined the life that had grown from that moment of devastation. The Family Legacy Institute had helped thousands of families heal from inheritance trauma and family secrets. The Generation Center Network provided community and purpose for elderly adults, while training young people in the arts of caregiving and connection. And most importantly, their story had inspired countless other families to choose love over resentment, understanding over judgment, healing over perpetual pain. But Sarah's greatest pride was in watching how each generation had taken the core lessons and made them their own. Alex had brought psychological training and systematic thinking to the work, creating protocols that could be replicated and scaled. Emma was already dreaming of ways to use emerging technology to help families connect across distance and difference. The safety deposit box that had started it all was long gone, but its true contents had multiplied beyond counting. Every family that learned to communicate honestly about difficult topics, every sibling relationship that survived the revelation of painful secrets, every child who grew up understanding that love was something you chose rather than something you were owed, carried forward the inheritance her father had really left. As Sarah made her way back toward the center's main building, she noticed a young woman sitting on one of the garden benches, crying quietly. Sarah recognized her as Jennifer Martinez's daughter Sophia, who was visiting the center with her mother for a reunion celebration. "Are you all right, dear?" Sarah asked, sitting down beside her. Sophia looked up with tear-filled eyes. "I was just thinking about what my family was like before you helped us. My mom and uncle were so angry at each other, and I thought that was just how families were supposed to be. I was planning to cut them all off when I turned 18 because I thought that was the only way to protect myself from the drama." She wiped her eyes and continued. "But instead I got to watch them learn how to love each other better. I got to see that families can heal, that people can change, that love is stronger than old hurts. And now I'm studying family therapy because I want to help other families the way you helped mine." Sarah felt the familiar warmth that came from seeing their work ripple forward through generations. "Your family taught us things too, you know. Every family we work with shows us new ways that love can triumph over pain. Do you think it will keep going? This work, this mission, even after?" Sophia gestured vaguely, unable to voice the reality of mortality. Sarah smiled, thinking of Alex's dedication, Emma's innovations, and all the young people like Sophia who were carrying the mission forward in their own ways. "I think the best ideas have a life of their own," she said. "They plant themselves in people's hearts and keep growing, generation after generation. My father's gift wasn't really the money, or even the lessons he taught us. It was the understanding that love is not a finite resource that gets used up, but a renewable energy that gets stronger the more it's shared." As they sat together in the peaceful garden, surrounded by the community that had grown from one man's complex final gift, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. The story that had begun with what seemed like betrayal had become a testament to the power of intentional love and chosen family. The safety deposit box was empty, but its legacy lived on in every family that chose healing over hurt, in every generation that received not just resources but responsibility, in every person who learned that the most valuable inheritance is the courage to love without condition and the wisdom to know that family is something you build, day by day, choice by choice, act of love by act of love. And as the sun set over the gardens where multiple generations had learned to choose each other, Sarah knew that her father's greatest gift would continue to multiply and spread, creating new possibilities for connection and healing, as long as there were people willing to believe that love, not blood, makes a family, and that the best legacies are not preserved but transformed, growing richer and more generous with each passing year. The inheritance was complete, but the story would never end. It would continue in every family that chose love over resentment, in every person who learned that healing was possible, in every generation that received the gift of understanding that family is not a limitation but a liberation that keeps expanding to include whoever needs to be included. Her father's safety deposit box had contained the key to everything that mattered, and that key had unlocked not just their family's potential for healing, but a multi-sided understanding that would ripple forward through time, touching lives and mending hearts for generations yet to come. Sarah smiled one last time at the empty safety deposit box in her memory, knowing that the greatest inheritance anyone could leave was not what they gave their children, but what their children chose to give the world. The end.